When did you realize the love of your life was actually a sociopath? I was playing Truth or Dare with my girlfriend Kora, and now I think I have to call the cops on her. The game started innocent enough with people choosing dares like chugging hot sauce or texting embarrassing things to their parents. As the night went on and more drinks were consumed, the questions got more personal. Sarah asked her boyfriend about his worst breakup. Jacob admitted he'd cheated on his boyfriend with a professor college. Everyone was getting loose and sharing secrets they'd normally keep hidden. Kora kept giggling and leaning against me, seeming totally relaxed. Then it was Ralph's turn to ask Kora a truth question. He got this mischievous look and asked what the freakiest thing she'd ever done in bed was. Everyone laughed and expected her to say something tame or refuse to answer. But Kora took another sip of her drink and got this proud smile on her face. "I took off his rubber without him noticing," she said, pointing at me. The room went quiet for a second. I felt my face get hot as I processed what she'd just said. That had never happened, at least not that I was aware of. We'd always been careful about protection since neither of us wanted kids yet. I turned to look at her, confused and uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light even though my face was turning. Kora laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. She was clearly drunk, but not wasted enough to not know what she was saying. The other couples were exchanging awkward glances while Brandon turned the music up a little louder. Everyone could feel the sudden tension in the room. "Oh, come on, don't look so serious," Kora said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. If she'd really done that without telling me, it was a massive violation of trust. We'd specifically talked about being safe and responsible. She knew I wasn't ready to be a father. The fact that she was treating it like a funny party story made me feel sick. Sarah tried to change the subject by asking someone else truth or dare, but I couldn't let it go. I asked Kora when this had supposedly happened. She rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. The other couples were getting more uncomfortable by the second. Jacob suggested we take a break from the game. "You're ruining the fun," Kora complained, but she could see I was genuinely upset. Ralph and his girlfriend Ariella started gathering their things to leave. The party atmosphere was completely dead now. Brandon tried to lighten the mood by offering to order pizza, but nobody was interested. Kora kept insisting I was overreacting to a harmless joke. As people started making excuses to leave, Kora grabbed my arm. She was annoyed that I'd killed the party vibe over what she called a silly admission. I pulled her aside to the corner of the basement where we could talk privately. My hands were shaking as I tried to understand what she'd meant. "Kora, did you really do that?" "When?" She sighed dramatically and leaned against the wall. Her casual attitude about something so serious was making me angry. This wasn't some funny anecdote to share at parties. This was about consent and trust and potentially life-changing consequences. "God, you're such a baby sometimes," she said. "It was just once, maybe twice. I wanted to see what it felt like without it." My mind was racing. Once or twice? How had I not noticed? And more importantly, what if she'd gotten pregnant? We'd never discussed that possibility because we'd agreed to always use protection. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. "What if you'd gotten pregnant?" I asked, my voice cracking. That's when Kora's expression changed. She got this strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced around to make sure the others were far enough away, then leaned in close to me. Her breath smelled like vodka and something sour. She whispered in my ear with that same casual tone she'd used all night, like she was sharing gossip instead of admitting to something horrible. The words came out so easily, like she'd been holding them in and was relieved to finally say them. "Don't worry." I aborted it, just like I did with your brothers. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a second I couldn't move or think or even breathe properly. My legs felt like they were made of water, and the basement walls seemed to tilt and spin around me while Kora just stood there with that weird smile still on her face. She actually looked proud of herself, like she'd just shared some funny secret instead of telling me she'd been with my brother and gotten rid of 2 babies without ever saying a word to me. My chest got tight, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears while the music from the party seemed to fade into static. I pushed past her hard enough that she stumbled back against the wall, and I heard her say something, but the words didn't register because I was already moving toward the stairs. My legs barely worked right, and I had to grab the railing to pull myself up each step while Brandon called out asking if everything was okay. The basement door felt too heavy when I shoved it open, and the cooler air of the main floor hit my face, but it didn't help the sick feeling rising in my throat. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I kept moving through the living room where a couple people were still hanging out, and they looked up confused as I rushed past them toward the front door. The handle stuck for a second, and panic shot through me before it finally turned, and I burst out onto the front porch. I made it 3 steps into the yard before my stomach gave up completely, and I threw up in Brandon's mom's flower bushes, my whole body shaking while I gripped my knees trying to stay upright. The porch light clicked on, and I heard the door open behind me, and Kora's voice cut through the night air telling me to stop being so dramatic about everything. She came down the steps in those stupid heels she always wore to parties, and stood there with her arms crossed while I was still bent over trying to catch my breath. She kept saying I was making a scene and ruining everyone's night over nothing important, and couldn't we just go back inside and talk about this later when I wasn't being such a baby about it? I straightened up and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, and when I looked at her, she actually rolled her eyes at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "We're done," I said, and the words came out rough and shaky, but I meant them completely. She laughed and said I didn't mean that, and reached for my arm, but I pulled away and started walking down the street, even though my apartment was at least 4 miles away, and I'd been drinking earlier. She yelled after me that I was being stupid and overreacting and where was I even going to go, but I didn't turn around or answer her. After a minute, I heard her heels clicking back up the porch steps, and the front door slammed shut, and she was probably going back to the party to tell everyone I was being crazy. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my phone out of my pocket, and I almost dropped it twice trying to unlock it. I found my brother's number and hit call, but it just rang and rang before going to voicemail, and I tried again with the same result. The street was dark and empty, and my legs felt weak, but I kept walking and trying to call him over and over while my brain kept replaying what Kora had said. My brother and my girlfriend had been together, and she'd gotten pregnant and never told me about any of it. The walk took forever, and my feet hurt, and I was still dizzy, but I couldn't stop moving because if I stopped, I'd have to actually think about what just happened. Cars passed by occasionally, and one slowed down like they might offer a ride, but I waved them off and kept going. It was almost 2 in the morning when I finally made it to our apartment complex and saw my car sitting in its usual spot. I got in and locked the doors but couldn't make myself go inside the apartment because my brother was in there, and I didn't know how to face him or what I'd even say. I sat there for over an hour just staring at the building and watching the lights in different apartments turn off one by one until everything was dark and quiet. My phone battery was almost dead from all the failed calls, and I knew I couldn't sit in the car forever, so I finally got out and walked to the door. The apartment was dark when I went in, and I could see my brother's bedroom door was closed with no light coming from underneath it. I went straight to my room and turned the lock and fell onto my bed, still wearing my shoes and jacket. The ceiling had this water stain I'd been meaning to paint over for months, and I just stared at it while my mind went in circles trying to understand how long this had been going on and how I'd missed all the signs. Around 6, I heard my brother's alarm go off, and then his door opening and him moving around the apartment getting ready for his morning run like he did every single day. His footsteps paused outside my door for a second, but then continued to the kitchen where I heard him filling his water bottle and grabbing his keys. The front door closed, and I waited another 5 minutes to make sure he was really gone before going out to the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the same as always, with his dirty coffee mug in the sink and his work badge on the counter where he always forgot it. My phone buzzed with a text, and when I looked, it was from Kora saying we needed to talk about what I thought I heard last night. She'd added 3 eye-roll emojis and said she was too hungover to deal with my drama right now, and could I please just chill out until she felt better. I didn't answer and went back to my room when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside. My brother came back from his run about 40 minutes later, and I could hear him in the kitchen making breakfast and humming some song under his breath, like nothing in the world was wrong. He knocked on my door and asked if I wanted eggs, and when I didn't answer right away, he tried the handle but found it locked. "You okay in there?" he asked through the door, and I mumbled something about not being hungry and needing to sleep more. He said okay, and that he'd save me some food in the fridge if I changed my mind, and then I heard him sitting down at the table eating alone while scrolling through his phone like any other morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I grabbed it to see Brandon's name on the screen, asking if I was okay after leaving so suddenly last night. I typed back that I needed some time to figure things out, and he replied right away saying he understood, and mentioned Kora seemed pretty wasted by the time everyone left. I put the phone down and opened my laptop, typing reproductive coercion into the search bar because I needed to understand if what she did had a name. Article after article popped up explaining how removing protection without consent was actually illegal in some places and considered a form of sexual assault. The violation of trust felt even worse now that I was reading about other people who'd gone through the same thing and seeing there were actual legal terms for what she'd done to me. My stomach churned as I read about cases where people had pressed charges and won, though most of the stories were about women, and I wondered if anyone would take me seriously as a guy. I kept reading for hours, learning about consent laws and how some states had specific statutes about reproductive coercion, while others didn't recognize it at all. The clock on my laptop showed it was almost noon when I finally closed it and stood up, my back aching from sitting hunched over for so long. I walked down the hall and stood outside my brother's door for a full minute before working up the courage to knock. The sound of his video game paused, and he called out for me to come in, barely looking up from his screen when I pushed the door open. I asked if we could talk about something important, and he just shrugged, his fingers still gripping the controller like he was ready to unpause any second. Standing there in his doorway, I forced myself to ask him directly if anything had ever happened between him and Kora. His whole body went stiff, and the controller slipped from his hands, clattering onto the floor as his face turned white. He started stammering that they'd just hung out a few times when I was at work. Nothing happened, but he wouldn't look at me and kept reaching down to pick up the controller, then setting it back down. These were the same tells from when we were kids, and he'd broken something or gotten in trouble at the school, the way he'd fidget with whatever was nearby and refuse to make eye contact. I stepped into his room and closed the door behind me, then told him what Kora had said about the abortion. His whole body went rigid like someone had dumped ice water on him, and he started firing off rapid questions about when she'd said it and how she could possibly know that, and was I sure I'd heard her right. The way he was trying to figure out if it was even possible told me everything I needed to know, and my legs felt weak as I sank down onto his desk chair. My phone started buzzing with texts, and when I looked, it was Kora saying she was coming over to get her stuff from my room and asking if I'd be there or if she should use her key. I told my brother we weren't done talking, but I had to go pack up her things before she arrived, and he just nodded, staring at his game screen without seeing it. Back in my room, I grabbed a cardboard box from the closet and started throwing her stuff in, her extra clothes and makeup and the phone charger she always left plugged in by my bed. I was pulling her gym bag out from behind my winter coats when something fell out, and I saw it was a pregnancy test box hidden way in the back where I'd never look. The receipt was still taped to it, and when I checked the date, it was from 2 months ago, right when she'd told me she was visiting her sister for the weekend. My hands were shaking as I shoved the box into my pocket and finished packing her things, then carried the box out to the living room to wait. 20 minutes later, I heard her key in the lock and she walked in like everything was normal, asking why I was being so weird and saying we needed to talk about my overreaction last night. I handed her the packed box without saying anything, and she rolled her eyes, muttering that I was being ridiculous and dramatic over nothing. That's when I pulled the pregnancy test box from my pocket and held it up, watching her face as she saw what it was. She just shrugged like it was no big deal and said she'd had a scare but handled it, acting like I should be grateful she didn't bother me with it. The casual way she said handled it made my skin crawl, and I asked her what that meant exactly, though I already knew the answer from the way she was looking at me with that same dismissive expression from last night. I asked her what else she was hiding from me and pointed at the door, telling her to get out of my apartment right now. She rolled her eyes again and said I was acting like a child over something that happened months ago and didn't even matter anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the cardboard box and shoved it into her arms, then asked her point blank if anything happened between her and my brother. Her face changed for just a second before she got that defensive look and crossed her arms over the box. She said whatever happened between them was none of my business anymore since we were broken up now anyway. The way she said, whatever happened, made my stomach drop because it basically confirmed something did happen. I told her she had 10 seconds to leave before I threw her stuff out the window. She grabbed the box tighter and called me pathetic, then turned and walked toward the door, making sure to slam it hard enough that the pictures on the wall shook. The second she was gone, my brother's door creaked open, and he stepped into the hallway looking like he was going to throw up. His face was pale, and he kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. I asked him straight up what happened between them, and he started rubbing the back of his neck. That thing he always did when he was nervous. He said they kissed once when they were both drunk at that house party I missed because of work. His voice cracked when he said it was just kissing and nothing else happened, but he couldn't look me in the eye. I told him I knew he was lying and walked past him to my room, slamming my own door now. My laptop was still open on my desk, so I pulled up the campus health center website and started looking for appointment slots. The whole thing with Kora had me thinking about what else she might have done without telling me. I found the STI testing page and booked the earliest appointment they had, which wasn't for 3 more days. My phone kept buzzing with texts from my brother, but I ignored them all. Later that night, he knocked on my door saying dinner was ready, but I couldn't even think about eating. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks, and the smell of whatever he'd cooked just made me feel worse. I heard him walking back and forth in the hallway for a while before everything went quiet. Around midnight, I heard paper sliding under my door, and when I looked, it was a note in his messy handwriting. He wrote that he was sorry and wanted to explain everything when I was ready to listen. I crumpled it up and threw it in my trash can, then grabbed my phone to call Riku. He picked up on the 3rd ring even though it was late and asked what was wrong without me even saying anything. I told him I needed somewhere to crash for a few days and asked if his couch was free. He said yes immediately and told me I could come over whenever, no questions asked. That meant a lot because most people would have wanted details right away. I started throwing clothes into my gym bag along with my laptop and charger. My brother must have heard me moving around because he knocked again and asked if we could talk. I opened the door with my packed bag over my shoulder and told him I needed space to think. His face just crumpled when he saw the bag, and he started saying he understood and would be here whenever I was ready. I pushed past him without saying anything else and left. The drive to Riku's place took 20 minutes, and I spent the whole time gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I got there, Riku had already set up the couch with blankets and a pillow. He handed me a beer, and we sat down in his living room where I finally told him everything that had happened. I started with the party, and Kora's confession, then the abortion bombshell, and finally what she'd said about my brother. Riku listened without interrupting once, just nodding and letting me get it all out. When I finished, he set down his beer and said what Kora did was a fundamental violation of trust and consent. He said my anger was completely justified, and I shouldn't feel bad about kicking her out or needing space from my brother. Then he mentioned his cousin went through something similar with an ex who had messed with birth control on purpose. He said she ended up filing a police report, and the guy actually got charged with something. Riku pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, then wrote down a name and number on a piece of paper. He said Detective Lane Crawford specialized in these kinds of cases and might be able to help if I wanted to pursue it. I took the paper, but wasn't sure what to do with it. The next day, I kept picking up my phone to call the number, then putting it back down. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing and move on with my life. But another part knew what she did was seriously wrong and might even be criminal. I spent hours going back and forth, even typing the number in twice before deleting it. 3 days later, my health center appointment finally came around. The nurse who saw me was really professional when I explained why I needed comprehensive testing. She didn't judge or ask unnecessary questions, just marked everything down on her clipboard. After taking blood and urine samples, she mentioned they had counselors who specialized in reproductive coercion if I wanted to talk to someone. She said what happened to me was more common than people realized, and talking to someone might help me process it. I took her card and made an appointment with Mia Garrison for the next morning at 10. The counseling office was in a small building behind the main health center, with plants everywhere and soft lighting. Mia was younger than I expected, with short dark hair and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She had me sit in this big blue chair across from her desk, while she pulled out some forms and a yellow legal pad. I started telling her about the party and what Kora had said about removing protection without telling me. Mia stopped writing and looked right at me with this serious expression on her face. She said what Kora did was called reproductive coercion, and it was a serious violation of consent. She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and handed me several papers about sexual assault resources. I stared at the papers, feeling weird about those words being connected to what happened to me. Mia explained that taking off protection without permission was actually a form of sexual assault in many places. She said lots of people don't realize how serious it is because society doesn't talk about it enough. My hands were shaking as I read through the resources she'd given me. Mia noticed and pushed a box of tissues across the desk, even though I wasn't crying yet. She said my feelings of betrayal and violation were completely normal trauma responses to what happened. She wrote down a crisis hotline number on a sticky note and pressed it into my hand. We scheduled another appointment for the following week, and she walked me to the door saying to call any time if I needed to talk. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes just staring at the papers she'd given me. That evening, while I was heating up leftover Chinese food at Riku's place, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. He said Cora's friend Sydney Madden had come by the apartment looking for me and seemed really mad. He wrote that he didn't tell her where I was staying, but she kept pushing for information. I deleted the text without responding and went back to eating my food. About an hour later, my Facebook Messenger started going crazy with notifications. Sydney had found me through mutual friends and sent this huge long message about how I was being unfair to Kora. She said I was blowing everything out of proportion and that Kora was devastated by how I was treating her. The message went on for 3 paragraphs about how Kora was crying all the time and couldn't eat or sleep. Sydney called me controlling and said I was punishing Kora for a drunken joke that meant nothing. I took screenshots of everything before blocking her on all social media platforms. The next morning, I pulled out the paper Riku had given me with Detective Crawford's number on it. I dialed it 3 times before actually letting it ring through. Detective Crawford answered with this deep voice, and I stumbled through explaining who I was and why I was calling. He said he remembered Riku's cousin's case and suggested we meet at the station to discuss my options. 2 days later, I walked into the police station downtown, feeling like everyone was staring at me. Detective Crawford was this tall guy with gray hair who met me in the lobby and took me to a small interview room. He had me go through everything that happened at the party while he took notes on a laptop. He explained that what Kora did could qualify as reproductive coercion, which was becoming more recognized legally. He said cases like mine were really hard to prosecute because it often came down to one person's word against another's. He'd need to interview everyone who was at the party to see if anyone heard Kora's confession clearly. The whole process could take months, and he asked if I was prepared for that kind of timeline. I said yes, even though my stomach was doing flips thinking about this dragging on for months. He gave me his card and said he'd be in touch after talking to the other party guests. 3 days after that, the health center called saying my test results were ready. The nurse went through everything and said all the STI tests came back negative, which made me feel relieved. She reminded me that some things take longer to show up and scheduled another test for 3 months out. She marked it in their system and gave me a reminder card to stick on my fridge. A week went by before I finally answered one of my brother's texts saying we could meet to talk. I picked a coffee shop downtown that was always busy, so we'd have to keep things civil. When I walked in, he was already there in a corner booth looking terrible. His hair was messy, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He started apologizing before I even sat down, saying he was so sorry over and over. I told him to stop and just tell me the truth about what happened with Kora. He stared at his coffee cup for a long time before admitting they'd slept together once 3 months ago. He said it happened when I was away at that work conference in Seattle. They were both drunk, and it was a stupid mistake he'd regretted every single day since then. The timeline hit me like a punch in the gut because 3 months ago was exactly when Kora would have gotten pregnant. My hands went cold as I realized she might have been telling the truth about both pregnancies after all. My brother's face just crumpled and he started crying right there in the coffee shop with people staring at us. I pushed my chair back from the table and told him I needed more time before I could even think about forgiving him. He nodded while wiping his face with a napkin and said he was going to stay with our parents for a while to give me space at the apartment. The barista came over to ask if everything was okay, and I just shook my head and left some cash on the table. My brother stayed sitting there as I walked out into the bright afternoon sun. Back at Riku's place, I found a voicemail from Detective Crawford saying he needed to talk to me about something important. When I called him back, he explained that Sydney and Kora had been posting about me on social media all morning. They were calling me controlling and abusive and making up stories about how I'd been a terrible boyfriend. He said he was documenting everything because it could actually help show a pattern of harassment if we needed it for the case. I spent the next hour going through my social media accounts and blocking both of them on everything. My phone rang while I was doing this, and it was my dad calling from his office. My brother had just shown up at our parents' house and told them he was moving back home for a while. Dad asked what was going on, and I gave him a quick version of what happened with Kora and my brother. His voice got really quiet, which meant he was furious because Dad only gets quiet when he's really mad. He said what happened to me was serious and asked if I wanted him to pay for a lawyer to go after Kora for what she did. I told him Detective Crawford was already working on the criminal side, but Dad said I should also think about civil charges. He gave me the number for a lawyer friend of his who handled these kinds of cases. 2 days later, I was sitting in the lawyer's office downtown, going through everything again. She took notes on a yellow legal pad and explained I could file for a restraining order based on the online harassment and what Kora admitted at the party. We filled out all the paperwork, and she said the hearing would probably be scheduled within a week or two. The whole process took 3 hours, and by the end my hand was cramping from signing so many forms. The hearing got scheduled for the following Tuesday at the courthouse downtown. I showed up in my only suit and found Kora already there with her own lawyer looking annoyed. She tried to catch my eye, but I just stared straight ahead at the judge's bench. When it was our turn, the judge asked my lawyer to present our case first. She laid out everything that had happened, including the confession at the party and the social media posts. Kora's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and said I was just trying to get back at her for breaking up with me. The judge asked Kora directly if she'd posted those things online, and she admitted she had, but said it was just venting. The judge looked at the screenshots my lawyer had printed out and frowned at some of the things Kora had written about me. After about 20 minutes of back and forth, the judge granted me a temporary protection order. Kora had to stop contacting me completely and remove all the social media posts within 24 hours. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she looked really mad but didn't say anything else. Sydney kept posting stuff but was careful not to mention me directly anymore, which my lawyer said was smart on her part. I started seeing the therapist that Mia had recommended and went twice a week at first. Some sessions were really hard and I'd leave feeling worse than when I went in. Other times I felt like I was actually making progress understanding what had happened to me. The therapist helped me see that what Kora did was a serious violation, and my feelings about it were totally valid. She gave me exercises to do at home when I felt overwhelmed by everything. 3 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Detective Crawford called with an update. He'd interviewed everyone from the party, and several people had heard Kora's confession clearly. Combined with the harassment and some other evidence he'd found, he felt they had enough to forward the case to the prosecutor. He warned me the legal process would be slow and could take months before anything actually happened in court. But he believed we had a strong foundation for the case, and the prosecutor would probably take it seriously. That same week, my dad called to say my brother had sent a letter for me through him. Dad said he hadn't read it, but my brother wanted me to know he'd written it. I drove to my parents' house when I knew my brother would be at his job and picked up the envelope. Back at Riku's, I opened it and found 3 pages of my brother's messy handwriting. He took full responsibility for what he'd done and said he knew he'd destroyed our relationship. He wrote that he'd started seeing a therapist too and was trying to understand why he'd made such a terrible choice. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to make excuses, which I actually respected. He just wanted me to know he was working on himself and would give me all the space I needed. I folded the letter back up and stuck it in a drawer, not sure how I felt about it yet. 2 days later, Crawford called to say the prosecutor was moving forward with charges and they'd be arresting Kora that afternoon. I watched from my car as 2 officers walked up to her apartment building around 3 o'clock and came out 20 minutes later with Kora in handcuffs looking mad as hell. She saw my car and started yelling something, but the officers put her in the back of their patrol car before I could hear what she was saying. Crawford texted me that she'd probably make bail by evening since reproductive coercion wasn't considered a violent crime and she didn't have any prior arrests. Sure enough, her parents posted the $10,000 bond, and she was out by 8 that night posting on social media about how the system was broken and men could weaponize the courts against women. The trial date got set for 2 months out, which meant I had to keep dealing with this mess through the holidays. Riku showed up at my apartment the next weekend with his truck and a bunch of boxes saying we were getting me out of the place I'd shared with my brother. We packed everything I owned in about 4 hours while my brother stayed at our parents' house to avoid the awkwardness. The new apartment Riku helped me find was smaller, but in a better part of town near a park where I could go running to clear my head. Moving my bed into the new place felt like starting over, even though I still had boxes of stuff that reminded me of Kora and my old life. Riku stayed to help me set up the TV and put together the cheap desk I'd bought online. 3 weeks into living at the new place, I got a call from my lawyer saying Kora's attorney wanted to discuss a plea deal. They were offering to have her plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for 2 years probation and mandatory counseling instead of potential jail time. My lawyer explained that trials were expensive and stressful, and this would guarantee she'd face consequences while also getting help for whatever made her think her actions were okay. I told her I needed time to think about it and spent the next few days going back and forth in my head. My therapist helped me work through what I really wanted from this whole situation during our next session. She asked if seeing Kora in jail would actually make me feel better, or if I just wanted acknowledgement that what she did was wrong. My dad drove up to have dinner with me, and we talked about it over Chinese takeout at my new kitchen table. He said whatever I decided he'd support, but reminded me that dragging this out in court would keep the wound fresh for months. After sleeping on it for another 2 nights, I called my lawyer and said I'd accept the plea deal if Kora had to publicly admit what she did and register as a sex offender. The plea hearing happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later at the courthouse downtown. Kora showed up in a conservative black suit, looking nothing like the party girl who'd laughed about violating me that night in Brandon's basement. The judge made her stand and read a statement, admitting she'd removed contraception without consent, and understood this was a form of sexual assault. Her voice was flat, and she kept looking at her lawyer instead of me, but at least the words were on record now. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced her to 2 years probation with mandatory weekly counseling and registration as a sex offender, which would follow her for at least 10 years. Kora's parents glared at me as they left the courtroom, but I didn't care what they thought about their daughter facing consequences for her actions. That night, I got an email from my brother with the subject line just saying sorry again. He wrote that he'd seen the news about Kora's plea and wanted me to know he was still in therapy working through his own issues that led to betraying me. I didn't respond right away, but after a week I wrote back saying I appreciated him taking responsibility, and maybe we could talk in a few months when things weren't so raw. We started exchanging emails every couple weeks with just basic stuff at first, like how work was going or what shows we were watching. Neither of us mentioned Kora or tried to pretend things would go back to normal, but it was something. 6 months after that horrible party, I was sitting in a circle of metal chairs in a church basement with 7 other guys who'd gone through similar experiences with reproductive coercion. The support group met every Thursday, and hearing their stories made me realize how common this actually was and how rarely people talked about it. One guy's wife had lied about being on birth control for 3 years trying to trap him in the marriage. Another man's girlfriend had retrieved used condoms from the trash to try to get pregnant without his knowledge. I even started dating again, though it took me 4 months after the plea hearing to download the apps, and another month to actually meet someone for coffee. On first dates, I was upfront about valuing consent and communication, which scared some women off, but attracted others who appreciated the honesty. The girl I'd been seeing for 3 weeks understood why I wanted to take things slow and always asked before trying anything new physically. What Kora did changed me, but sitting in my new apartment planning a 4th date, I finally felt like I was building something better from the wreckage she'd left behind. Thanks for being here through the tough parts. If this helped even a little, I'm glad you stayed. Subscribe and come back for more steady steps forward.